Heejun Chang is the PI on a collaborative project of which I'm a part of, and the goal of which is to understand how climate change and land use change interact to influence the provisioning and also the valuation of ecosystem services on an actual landscape. And the landscape that we've chosen for this study is just south of here in the Yamhill and Tualatin basins in the northern Willamette Valley. And this is a great area, very interesting area to do this sort of work on because it's an area that's been changing relatively rapidly and is projected to change rapidly, mostly due to urbanization. It's also an area that we suspect will be subject to climate change, and so it's a very interesting area from that respect. It's also a very interesting area to do this type of work because there's been a lot of previous work on ecosystem services and on trying to understand the relations of the people living and working and using those services in this region, how those interactions work, and both in terms of how ecosystem services are valued in the region and also how we best are able to utilize those resources in things like regional planning and things like that. And so one of the sort of goals of the project, or one of the sort of prerequisites that we had going into this project, was we wanted to tap into that existing knowledge. There's been a whole lot of work and real innovative thought and thinking among various stakeholders in the region around this topic. And so we wanted to bring that expertise into this project. And so the talk that I'm going to give you today, what Heejun wanted to tell you, is a little bit about our experience with bringing in that expertise and collaborating with the stakeholders in this project, and a little bit sort of what we've learned and gained from that experience. All right. So so I said sort of one reason that we wanted to really think about stakeholders really explicitly in this project was because this previous knowledge and experience that this region has. But another sort of reason we wanted to obviously bring in stakeholders is because the subject matter of ecosystem services. So this slide here is sort of the kind of the generic definition of ecosystem services. And I love this definition because it sort of can encompass almost any possible interaction between humans and the biosphere that you can think of. And which is a good thing on one hand, but it's also, it suggests that people can have very different definitions of what ecosystem services actually mean for them, and also very different valuations. And one of the challenges with trying to utilize ecosystem services as a policy tool or a conservation tool is reconciling those different ideas and conceptualizations about ecosystem services. Here's just sort of another example of this. This is sort of the classification from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And from here you can also see that there are very different sorts of ecosystem services. It's inherently an anthropogenic construct, right? And so in this project, we really wanted to get a handle on what do people in this region, the Tualatin and the Yamhill basins here in Oregon, what are the ecosystem services that are really most important to them? What relative values do they place on these ecosystem services? So a big chunk, as I'll show you in a second, a big chunk of this project involves modeling and trying to understand the provisioning of ecosystem services and how climate change and land use change influence that. But also a big part of the project is trying to understand what is the real human impact of any of these predictive changes. So one of the things that we wanted also to avoid in this project is what has been termed this paradigm lock. And you can see in this slide here, sort of I come from the sort of more the left-hand side of this, where you sort of develop ideas at places like this, at meetings, scientific meetings. You propose hypotheses, you do that research, you get some understanding, you go present at meetings like this, which generates new ideas. You can do that sort of independently of whether that understanding and knowledge ever gets translated into helping to solve real-world problems. And similarly, sort of the folks who are engaged in trying to solve those real-world problems, or more broadly, are sort of users of ecosystem services, or are managers of those ecosystem services, can oftentimes get stuck on sort of things, on very narrow sort of constructs that don't relate very directly to sort of new understanding about science and processes which are going on. So here's just sort of another depiction of that left-hand side of the slide, sort of a typical sort of scientific process. You get data collection, you do data analysis, you do modeling, scenario development, develop decision support systems, transfer model results to stakeholders. This is very sort of a hierarchical sort of thing, and sort of the idea is, it's very much like, you make this product and there it is. Obviously, someone should be able to use it, right? Go off and use it. And so this is not anything new. And as I said, sort of particularly in where I come from, sort of applied agricultural sciences, people have realized that this oftentimes doesn't work. And instead, what you need is to more explicitly, from the very beginning, involve the potential end users of that information, or stakeholders in the sort of jargon of the, sort of to use a jargon word, of folks who are going to use that process. So even though they're end users, if to make something which is actually really usable for them, you really need to engage them at the very beginning. When you are first coming up with an idea, what are the actual issues that you need to address? So this is sort of the broad outline for what we were trying to do. When you think about sort of two broad ways that sort of science and the output of scientific processes can interact with stakeholders in the broader community, one is scientists can disseminate information. You can also develop practical steps toward implementation, so developing decision tools. And I would add another one on here, which is sort of actually engaging people in the process of doing the science itself. And like anything, if you're actively engaged in that process and have input in that process, the sort of value you put in that information that comes out is going to be much better. All right, so this is, I think Heejun violated at least probably 3 of the 10 commandments of things you shouldn't do in PowerPoint slides. But this is our project sort of design, and you can see the sort of top half of it is sort of basically things that we're doing in terms of the research. So we're collecting information, we're running different models, we're building scenarios, and the bottom half of it shows you sort of the sort of stakeholder component to the project. So basically, we sort of engage stakeholders in 3 kind of broad points in time in this project. Once, at the very beginning of the project, we brought them in to help identify, help sort of guide us in the process. Then we brought them in for another workshop to help sort of, after we had done some of the analysis, to give feedback. And then we were going to bring them in at the end of the project to see if this actually is of any use to them. Here's sort of a kind of another broad sort of picture of the project. We have these sort of inputs that we're modeling sort of current conditions, and also we have land use and climate change scenarios, and we're running these different models to see how those land use and climate change scenarios relate to ecosystem services provision. And this is sort of an example of one area where this feedback from users came in, and that was in the development of these land use scenarios. So we use sort of the expert knowledge in the area to have them help us understand what is the way that urbanization is going to proceed in this study area. And so we use that, and Wes will talk a little bit more about this, we use that sort of information from these stakeholders to help define these land use scenarios. We also sort of asked them, well, what are the actual management things you're doing now to mitigate some of the potential impacts of this land use change and climate change? And so we included those actual management scenarios in our land use scenarios as well. Here's sort of one other piece of information that we got out from SECO. So we sort of asked them the question, what ecosystem services do you value? And sort of the one result was basically you value them all. Sort of like me asking what type of pie I like. I like sort of almost all pie. But if you delve into a little bit more, you realize that actually sort of if you disaggregate the information, each individual has their own sort of specific information, and we could use that information to define the actual specific scenarios and questions that we were asking in this study.